Welcome everyone to Things Around 8. Dear friends, in this video we will talk about Russian artillery, and why it is considered the most powerful and lethal in the world. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bells so you don't miss any news. On August 1, 1914, Russia, led by Tsar Nicholas II, was catapulted into the First World War due to an uncontrolled sequence of events that pushed the gigantic Russian Empire into a conflict for which it was completely unprepared. Despite its colossal size and huge population, among the major powers of the time, Russia was one of the most backward in terms of technology and industry. It was essentially a gigantic feudal state inhabited by millions of peasants, with the country still taking its first steps towards complete modernization and industrialization. For this reason, Khazar had a large military contingent at its disposal to launch into battle. But on the other hand, it was an army that was very weak in terms of mechanical resources and especially in terms of artillery, precisely the type of weapon that stood out most in that conflict. The lack of sufficient artillery pieces forced Russia to remain on the defensive, facing a much better equipped and armed German Imperial Army in all areas. Faced with this situation, in 1915, Khazar launched an impressive effort to modernize Russian heavy industry, resulting in significant increases in the production of weapons and ammunition, especially artillery, with the production of artillery shells increasing 40 times in the space of just 1 year. But despite all this effort, German stockpiles were much larger, resulting in a constant German superiority in terms of artillery, which served to keep Khazar's gigantic Russian armies always under heavy pressure and on the defensive. This actively contributed to the weakening of the Tsar's leadership, paving the way for the Communist Revolution of 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin, resulting in a humiliating defeat for Russia in the First World War, which even involved the loss of vast territories. The terrible experience of Tsarist Russia in that conflict, caused mainly by the lack of artillery, left such a strong mark on the Soviet leadership that it led, in the early 1920s, to an ambitious program to expand the country's arms industry. A program very focused on mechanization and mainly on the development and production of artillery pieces. For this reason, in the interwar period, the Soviet Union was one of the countries that made the most progress in this area, also standing out in the production of the most varied types of pieces and howitzers. And so, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin had at his disposal a powerful and truly gigantic artillery arsenal. Due to a long series of disastrously flawed strategic decisions, the Germans advanced almost unstoppably during the first 6 months of the invasion, eventually coming within just 30 kilometers of the center of Red Square in Moscow. But despite the retreats and the monumental losses of soldiers, Soviet artillery played its part, helping to prevent the disaster from becoming even greater. Throughout the conflict, Soviet artillery was clearly evolving and adapting, resulting in truly iconic weapons such as the Katyusha, a multiple rocket launcher that, despite being simple and very easy to produce and operate, was extremely lethal, with the sound of its firing spreading panic throughout the German lines. From early 1943, when the tide of the war turned completely in favor of the Allies, Soviet artillery adapted, starting to play an offensive role rather than merely defensive, with Soviet artillery fire softening up German positions before the advance of infantry and armor. And it was largely thanks to its overwhelming advantage in terms of artillery that the Soviet Union fought its way along the Eastern Front towards Berlin, first passing through millions of German soldiers scattered throughout Eastern Europe. When that war ended, the decisive role of artillery left a deep mark on the Soviet armed forces. For Moscow, if artillery had been fundamental to defeating Germany, it would certainly also be important in a possible war against the West led by the United States, leading the Soviets to continue investing heavily in the development and production of increasingly advanced artillery systems. This resulted in a wide range of weapons, such as 11 different types of self-propelled howitzers. Highlights include the two S-3 Acacia and the two S-19 Mista, both 152 mm and the most produced during the Cold War, and 8 different types of multiple rocket launchers, such as the BM-21 Grad, the direct successor to the Katyusha, and the TOS-1A, considered the most lethal multiple rocket launcher in the world, capable of launching up to 24 rockets armed with thermobaric warheads. And that's without forgetting field artillery, with the Soviets producing thousands of them, such as the 122mm D30 and the 152mm 2A65 Mista B. In terms of technology, in certain areas, such as firing long-range precision projectiles, Russia is well behind the West, which operates very advanced systems such as the HIMARS. But when it comes to the mission of saturating enemy positions, Russia remains the unbeatable leader. And so, thanks to the lessons learned over more than 100 years of conflict, Russia is today considered the greatest global power in terms of artillery, with all this advantage being used against Ukraine since the beginning of the Russian invasion in February 2022. Even with Ukraine receiving huge quantities of weapons from the West, Russian superiority in artillery remains unbeatable, with the Russians achieving, in certain sectors of the front, an advantage of almost 10-1. In other words, for every artillery round fired by Ukraine, Russia responds with 10. The more shells an army can fire, the more limited the enemy's ability to move becomes, which translates into great difficulties for the Ukrainian army in organizing its defense, and mainly, organizing offensive actions to try to retake positions occupied by the invader. The lessons learned from the past are fundamental for modern military campaigns, with this maxim also applying, and especially, to artillery. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news.